Imagine for a moment a postman walking his route on your street. But it's not long before you notice that I am not your regular postman, delivering the mail you might normally expect. You see, I deliver stories, tales of the grim and mysterious in particular. Ghosts and shadows haunt these pages, some inspired by true stories, others entirely from my own mind. And if you decide you're brave enough to see what I've delivered today, well, I warned you.
Christmas Lights. A Christmas Ghost Story by David Sauter. The date is December the 27th, 2021. I write these things down now because my hands have finally stopped trembling enough to allow me to do so, and so that I can remember in future winters what happened several nights ago. Although to you, the reader, it might seem foolish to do so, considering the bizarre nature of the following story, that you might think that there is no way on God's earth that anyone could ever forget such an experience. I have found that in most cases, the stubbornness of the human heart can grow exponentially with the passage of time. On December 24th, I had returned home from work to the smell of my wife's pot roast wafting through the air. She and my daughter had both eaten already, as I was coming home at my usual time, late. I had the bad luck of leaving my former employer and starting my own business in the latter half of 2019, just a little before the pandemic of 2020. We obviously struggled, but as time went on, we were able to bounce back a little, although we still are not exactly where we were hoping to be, which is the reason I had become sort of, I guess you could say, a hard employer over the last several months. It is important to note that I have one full-time employee that has been with me since nearly the company's founding a couple years ago. Her name is Wren Hardbrook. We were by no means friends, as I tried to keep my working relationships as professional as possible to avoid getting into the entanglements of favors and whatnot that friendships tend to bring with them, which I was sure at the time I had no time for. I bring up Wren because she is central to the events of that night, and that was one of the first topics brought up between me and my wife that night as I walked through the garage door while she was cleaning up the kitchen after dinner. "Dinner is in the microwave," she had told me as I removed my boots on the rug. "Smells good," I said. "Everything buttoned up at the office?" "Everything that can be buttoned up is buttoned up," I said, then smelling the pot roast. "Everything that isn't, well..." "What do you mean, everything that isn't? Didn't Scepter get back to you?" I pulled my dinner from the microwave and could tell it was lukewarm immediately. I tread carefully with my reply as I snagged a cold beer from the fridge. "They, wanted a little more time." "Well, that works, I guess," she said, loading the dishwasher. "You and Wren were able to get the plans finalized for the main hall?" The truth was that Scepter set a deadline for the main hall project, a deadline that we were not expecting, and we needed this project. I had already booked the tickets for my wife and I's trip. We were supposed to leave on Christmas, which was the very next day, and be gone for a week. For the sake of the story, I won't get into much of the details. But the bottom line was, we were not prepared for this deadline at the company, and that meant that I had to play hard boss with Wren earlier that day. "I just want to apologize in advance," I had said while I took my coat off the hanger at the office. Wren's expression was that of confusion and anxiety, as one normally looks when your employer apologizes for something that they haven't done yet. I proceeded then to explain to Wren that she would not be able to have Christmas morning off, as somebody needed to be there to finalize that bid. She was stunned silent at first, then asked why it couldn't be done the next day. I told her every competing company and their brother would be taking Christmas off as well, and if we got that bid finished ASAP, We could be the first one in, and one of the lowest. I tried explaining how that sort of resolve is important to an institution like Scepter, and that it could all but guarantee this is my project. None of this was good enough, however, and she said, in as polite a way as she knew I would allow, that she felt like I was going back on my word, and that this didn't show good character on my part. "I'm sorry," I told her, "but this needs to be done." "Why don't you do it then?" "Ren, you know I'm taking my family south for Christmas this year. This is all just bad timing." At this point, I could see the glaze over Ren's eyes, but I was too far into this conversation to care now. "Well, my family's been going to my grandfather's house on Christmas morning for my entire life," she said. "And my husband, you know that story already, Dan, but for my son, it's important." "Look, Ren, I don't know how many times I can say sorry, but your job is kind of on the line here. I'm happy to give you employment so you can provide for your son, but sometimes you need to work with me a little bit." "Dan, I'm happy to work with you sometimes, but Christmas morning is not just important to my kid. It's important to my whole family. You see, having the family over for Christmas was always very special to my grandpa. And last year he passed away, so—" "Well, it shouldn't be that important to him anymore then," I interrupted impatiently. And with that, the argument ended. The statement even shocked me. I didn't even say goodnight or see you next week. I just walked out into the snow. "Yeah, we got the plans done," I told my wife in response to her question. "Oh, good," she replied. "So you can both enjoy Christmas with no stress." Right. I didn't dare tell my wife about what I had just left. I knew immediately she would question my actions and take Ren's side, and that was a can of worms I didn't care to open at that moment. After eating, I went upstairs to tuck my girl, Sarah, into bed. She had already brushed her teeth and was laying in bed when I walked through her bedroom door, looking at a picture book I had gotten her when she was just a toddler. Now she was pushing 6. I sat on the bed next to her, the room lit only by her bedside lamp and the glow of the white Christmas lights hanging from the edge of the roof just outside her bedroom window. "Hey, Skeeter," I said, taking her book gently from her hands and folding it up on her nightstand. "How was your day?" "Fine. I didn't have school today." "I know, it's Christmas vacation," I said. "Isn't that fun?" She shrugged a little. "I miss my friends. Did I tell you that we made snow angels?" "I did hear that, actually. Mommy told me." "Did you know we made Christmas tree cookies today?" "Yeah, you mean Christmas cookies?" Sarah looked at her lamp. "Dad?" "What's up, hon?" "Do we have to go to the beach for Christmas? There's no snow there." I felt a bit of heat on my forehead. I knew already that the wife wasn't fully on board with the idea of going south for the holidays, and I didn't feel like fighting that battle with my 5-year-old too. One of my dreams with owning a successful business like ours was that I could set my own family schedule, and if we wanted to have Christmas in the tropics, then we could just do it. It was one of the privileges I was determined to live out. "That's true, hon, but did you know that there are much better things than snow down there?" "Like what?" Like the ocean, silly," I said, pulling her blanket up to her shoulders. "And like the sand, which is just as white as the snow, but warm, and it doesn't give you frostbite." Her eyes widened a little bit. "Frostbite?" "That's when the snow gets so cold up here that it grows a mouth and tries to bite you." "You're lying!" she exclaimed excitedly. "Well, it's not a risk worth taking," I said. "That's why we leave tomorrow morning, first thing. Now, it's time for bed, okay?" "Okay." "Daddy?" "What's up, darling?" "Who's that man in the window?" With those words, I felt a rush of blood drain from my face, and I spun toward the window. There was nothing there, just a string of Christmas lights hanging from the roof. although a couple of them were out. But the wind shook them a bit and they blinked back on. "What are you talking about, honey?" "I saw somebody there." I stood up and went to the window. Sarah's room was on the second floor, and there was no roof or ledges below that anybody could have climbed on. "I think your eyes are tired. Nobody's there, Skeeter." "Nobody?" "Nobody. I think you're so excited to sleep that you already started dreaming. Now, let's get to bed." After I kissed Sarah's forehead goodnight, I meandered to my bedroom where my wife was already snuggled in the covers. "Are you sure you want to leave before Christmas?" she asked. "It just feels kind of weird to not be home for the holidays." "Babe, we've been over this again and again," I said impatiently. "Let me have this for at least this year." "Are you sure you got everything done for work that you need to?" "Sure, I'm sure." "All right." She turned to her phone on the nightstand and picked it up. "Who are you texting?" "I was just thinking about Ren," she said. "I know it's just her and her boy, and I just thought it would be nice to wish her a Merry Christmas from her boss's family, since we didn't have time to make any cards this year." "What? No, don't do that," I blurted. "What? Why not?" "Well, she's probably trying to put her son to bed. I'll text her in the morning and do that. I'll send a picture of us on the road, too." "Oh, you sure?" "Yes, I promise I'll do it tomorrow." I was about to pull my shirt off and change into my pajamas when she spoke up again. "Oh, babe, wait. Could you do something for me real quick?" "What's that?" "I don't remember if I locked my car. Could you go down and check?" I groaned, but went downstairs anyway. I grabbed her keys off the hanger and walked to the kitchen window. My wife always parked her SUV in the driveway since we only had a one-stall garage on the house, and my truck was worth a lot more money. I peered through the glass and clicked the button on the key fob. The lights didn't flash. I pressed it again, and again there was nothing. "You sack of sh..." I went to the back room and slid my cold boots back on and threw my coat over my shoulders. Then I clomped through the house to the front door and stepped out into the snow. After I'd gotten what I deemed close enough to the car, I clicked the key fob and heard a high-pitched beep. The headlights flashed twice, and I knew my job was done. Then I turned back toward my front yard. I happened to glance up at all the Christmas lights the neighbors had decorating their houses down the street. It was very peaceful. Then I noticed something odd out of the corner of my eye. There in the snow stood a small pine of some sort in the front yard of my neighbors across the street. They had decorated most of the shrubs and trees in their front yard, as most of the neighborhood did, with lights spun all around this tree in particular. What I noticed was a small section of lights that were out, but it wasn't one single strand, which was the thing that struck me as strange. Usually, if a section of Christmas lights is out, it would be on just one strand or possibly even the whole string of lights. But this chunk of dead bulbs was all to one side of the tree. A small section of dead bulbs was near the top, which grew wide further down, then narrower as it continued toward the ground. All to one side. I had never seen a string of Christmas lights out like that before. I entered through the front door of my house again, and soon realized I was too wired now to sleep. I kept thinking about my last conversation at the office, which frustrated me still, and I decided that to get my mind off of it and dull my leftover energy, I would watch a little TV in the living room. I plopped myself down on the couch and sunk in quite nicely. An old Christmas special was on called Santa Claus is Coming to Town. The old stop-motion animation style made me uncomfortable as a child, and still did to this day. But I was just passing the time until I was finally tired enough to go back upstairs and sleep, although it didn't seem to be working at the moment. I realized that the bright living room light being on was not helping the situation, so I stood up, walked over to the wall, and flipped the switch down. Then the only lights were the Christmas tree in the corner, the blue glow of the TV, and the faint yellow white of the Christmas lights hanging just outside the living room window behind the couch. After sitting back down on the couch to continue watching the old TV special, it didn't take me long to notice the blank space in the middle of the reflection of the Christmas lights on the TV screen. I of course thought that was strange that it was happening a second time after noticing the exact same thing on the lights outside my daughter's bedroom window. I turned to the window behind me and saw 4 lights in the middle of the string of lights hanging from the gutter completely out. I stared at them for a moment, expecting them to blink back on as they did upstairs, but they didn't. I had bought all new Christmas lights for the house this year, so I immediately thought that it was strange that I would be having these issues. The weather had been mild all month since I put them up, so I knew they couldn't have been beaten up by the wind or something, so I just chalked it up to defective bulbs or wiring. Whatever the case, we were leaving home soon, so it wasn't a priority of mine to fix them in that moment. I decided that instead of going through the headache of returning them to the store when we got back from our trip, I would just take them down at the end of the year and throw them away. That was my last thought about it until I turned back toward my TV. My heart jumped with what I saw in the reflection of my TV screen next. Centered exactly where the 4 dead bulbs of the light string were was the unmistakable grinning face of an unfamiliar old man, whose features were lit by the lights that continued working, but his eyes were shrouded in shadow. The unsettling smile is still burned into my mind. With a startled expletive, I jumped off the couch and turned to face the stranger. But he was not there. Only the 4 dead bulbs swaying slowly in the gentle winter breeze. I turned back toward the TV, and the face had vanished. When I turned toward the window, the bulbs on the string of lights were working again. I thought I might be losing my mind for a moment, and got on my knees to get a better look at the TV while also grabbing the remote and turning it off to better see the reflection in the window. Still, no face, but those 4 bulbs were off again. I spun around, still on my knees, to the window. The bulbs were still burnt out, but when I slowly stood, they came back on. I crouched down again, and they turned off again. "What the?" I whispered to myself. I knew I hadn't imagined the face, and thought that maybe whoever it was could still be out in my yard, so I threw my coat back on along with my boots and stormed out the front door. The cold air bit at my face, but I wasn't bothered this time as I scanned all around my front yard. "Hey," I said, careful not to be too loud so as to not wake my wife unnecessarily. "Is anybody out here?" There was only silence. I glanced up and down the street, which was lit ablaze with all the neighbors' lights and Christmas decorations. Conceivable hiding places for an intruder seemed few and far between in the mix of bright white and multicolored glows. I decided to do a walk all the way around the house. Armed with my phone light, I proceeded through the snow, and by the time I had wrapped my way back around to my front door, I was confident that what I had seen was just my imagination. With all that out of the way, I noticed now that I seemed finally tired enough to go to sleep, and so I clomped my way back through the house to take off my boots. I then proceeded to turn off all the lights, starting with the living room where I had been, then the dining room. I decided to leave the Christmas tree on so that it would be on when we awoke Christmas morning. After that, I made my way to the kitchen and turned out those lights. I was about to turn the corner to go back upstairs toward my bedroom when I noticed something out of the corner of my eye. Turning towards it, I was amazed that what I saw was no trick of the eye. The Christmas tree was the only source of light in the whole house except for the faint glow of the lights outside. And what a source of light it was, thanks to the insane number of lights my wife had strung around it. Yet, in the middle of the tree, there was a dark shape. Not just any shape, however, as it was the very distinct and unmistakable shape of a man. The hair on my arms stood on end suddenly, and at first I began to think of how an intruder could have gotten in the house. I had left the front door unlocked when I began my search of the outside, so it was possible somebody could have slithered in that way. Regardless of how they got in, it was very clear to me that somebody was now standing in front of my Christmas tree, hunched over slightly, staring at me from the shadows. "Hey," I managed to blurt out as I flung the switch to the kitchen lights back on. To my shock, there was no one there. "How did..." I quickly scanned the room, yet I knew there was no way anyone could have run off that fast. As I looked back at the tree, however, I was stunned to see a plethora of dead bulbs in the middle of it, exactly where the trespasser had been standing. The section of dead bulbs, amazingly, was exactly in the shape of a human body. I closed my eyes tightly, then opened them. The bulbs were still out in the same pattern they had been. Then I turned the kitchen lights out again, and again the only source of light was the tree. The bulbs that were out were still in the familiar shape of the man. They didn't flicker or blink, they just happened to be out in that bizarre pattern. It made no sense to me, and in my attempt to wrap my head around it, I turned the kitchen lights back on. No matter whether the lights were on or off, the bulbs that were burnt out remained in the same pattern. When I turned the kitchen lights out this time, I just found myself staring at the shape of the tree. Suddenly, like the air around me itself had come to life, I heard a ghoulish crackling groan that grew louder, along with heavy footsteps running toward me in the dark. The shape on the tree grew larger, with more of the bulbs on the strands going out, and from my vantage point, it looked like, if there had been somebody standing in front of that tree, they had lunged at me in a matter of seconds, groaning all the way. I gasped like I had gotten the wind knocked out of me, but I felt no impact, and I fell backward to the floor simply out of fear and surprise. Then when I regained my composure, I noticed that the Christmas tree was fully lit again. I then picked myself up off the kitchen floor and ran upstairs to my wife. I slammed the door behind me, waking her suddenly. "I feel like I'm cracking up," I said after explaining all that had just happened. "Hey, calm down," she replied. "Just relax. I think it's just the stress from work. I think you just need some sleep." "How in the world can I sleep now? All that, everything I just told you. I don't think it was just in my head. It was all so real." "Honey, would it help if I went downstairs and looked at the tree with you?" "Come on, don't talk to me like a child," I groaned, standing up off the bed. "Where are you going?" "I'm going downstairs. Gonna step outside and get some fresh air or something. Maybe that'll clear my head." "You really need to think about going to bed," she called to me as I walked back out the bedroom door. "We have a long trip in the morning." "I'll sleep on the plane," I said, walking cautiously back down the stairs. I stopped to stare at the Christmas tree for a moment when I walked into the kitchen. Everything was normal. The tree was lit top to bottom. I was still observing it closely when suddenly a dark shape flew in front of my face. There was a low but loud hum, and I nearly leapt out of my pants. I flung the kitchen light on and looked in the direction the shape had fled. Planted still against the kitchen cabinet door was a large black moth. That was it. That was what the incident had been. I was seeing things before, just based on a moth flying in front of my face. The shape of the man in the lights was just a hallucination, probably, from the stress of work and the oncoming holiday trip. "Bah humbug," I grumbled, partly in jest at the moth. I wandered over to my coat, which was hanging up in the back room. Inside the left pocket was a crumpled up pack of cigarettes, which I had been keeping a secret from my wife. The first two I pulled from the pack were broken, but finally I found one intact. I stepped out the front door again to cool my head and lit my cigarette. The street was still lit up, and I glanced around to make sure all the lights were behaving normally after the games my head had played with me that night. So far, so good, and I decided a little walk down the block in the chilly night air was what I needed. Christmas lights of all kinds lined everyone's front fences along the sidewalk, and as I strolled down, if I had been paying better attention, I might have noticed a dead spot on the strings of lights which flowed down the wire, following my every step. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I noticed it. I stopped, and so did the shadow of dead bulbs. I only stared at it for a moment. Then suddenly it grew larger, and I felt a forceful push against me, knocking me to the pavement, as if something had lunged at me from the direction of the fence. Before I could recover myself, an invisible force grabbed me by the throat, and before I could react, I was hoisted into the air. I gasped for breath and grabbed for the invisible arms that held me, but my hands fell on nothing. I tried to cry out for help, but my voice couldn't overcome the horrible strangling sensation. Without warning, the strength of my attacker let loose, and I fell back to the cold ground. Although I was coughing and gasping in a desperate attempt to force air back into my lungs, I seized the moment and ran. There were no footsteps that followed to my recollection, but in my moment of terror, I didn't care. I lost all sense of direction in the panic, and I found myself running into one of my neighbor's yards by mistake. I just instinctively ran into the most well-lit area my eyes pulled me to. Perhaps it was just to get out of the shadows, so I could try to defend myself against the attacker, although the rationale for it now escapes me. I found myself in a snowy yard surrounded by pine trees and bushes. My neighbor had pine trees lining the entire front yard, and they had taken the time to decorate each one all the way up with different colored lights. I spun around dizzily, searching for any sign of life. A dog barked in the distance, but that was all at the moment. Coughing, I spun around again, this time to look for my house so I could make my way back home. And it was then that I saw it. The dead spot in the center of the lights decorating one of the pine trees. A huge swath of dead bulbs on the Christmas lights in the familiar shape of a man, now hunched over. Only this time it was not standing still. It walked from one side of the tree to the other, and as it did, the bulbs on the strands of lights would fire up again as the specter passed by. My eyes followed it in horror as it disappeared off one side of the tree, and the whole tree was lit once again. Then, after a moment of nothing, the tree a few feet to the right repeated the process. Dead bulbs in shape of this apparition, going out and turning back on as it moved from one end of the tree to the other. Again it vanished between the trees, then again appeared on the next one, only this time the shape of dead holiday lights was larger, as if the thing was walking nearer to me, casting a larger shadow. I was paralyzed and my heart was pounding. The shape had now moved to another tree and was again larger than before. It was blocking my path back home. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. My blood seemed all at once to leave my body, and I felt as cold as the snow around me. Suddenly, the figure in the lights stopped walking. I didn't make a move or a sound. I only continued to gawk at the figure, and I felt a cold bead of sweat drip down my forehead. Without a sound, the figure's head seemed to turn slowly. Whether it was toward me or away from me, I could not tell. Then its hunched body followed suit. Then its movements stopped. My assumption was that whatever it was staring directly at me. It wasn't that I didn't move. It was that I couldn't. I was frozen with fear. The entity in the lights did the same, and the longest time seemed to pass before I realized I was holding my breath, although I'm sure it couldn't have been more than a few seconds. I heard then the most otherworldly sound. I can only describe it as a strange mix between a groan and a howl as the figure in the lights grew suddenly massive again, indicating that once again it must have lunged at me with long arms outstretched. But I dove out of its way this time, landing on my chest in the snow, then quickly pushing myself off the ground and running back down the street in the direction of my house. I may have screamed for help as I tore down the street, but I can't remember. The world went past by me in a blur, and whereas I heard no steps following after me before, the same could not be said now. Heavy footsteps stomped through the snow behind me as fast as my own, and I shot forward with an inhuman burst of speed until I finally reached my front door. Grasping the cold metal knob of the front door in my hand, I tried to turn it, but my hand slipped off and my knuckles smashed into the door frame. My breath again was still. The door was locked. I must have locked it by accident when I stepped out earlier for a smoke. The footsteps behind me came down the front sidewalk, and I instinctively turned to face them, only to see something I almost couldn't comprehend. The flat shovel I had used the day before to push off the snow from my walkway was in the air now, not falling or being thrown, just holding there. An unseen force was holding the shovel, causing it to sway through the air. I turned back to the door and threw my fists against it, screaming my wife's name. The sound of the shovel scraping against the yard behind me caused my hair to stand erect. I glanced upward to the second-floor window, the window to the master bedroom. The light stayed off. The shovel slammed against the yard behind me and dug roughly against the snow and the mud. I screamed for my wife again, pounding my fists on the door till I thought those frozen knuckles of mine would shatter like glass. This time, the light upstairs turned on. Again, I looked over my shoulder to see the shovel swing upward, then down into the earth again as it scraped a deep gash across the yard. I was on my knees, banging on the door and yelling. I couldn't hear my wife coming down the stairs over my own commotion. I could only trust she was coming as fast as she could at the sound of my panic. Just then, the business end of the shovel slammed into the door next to my head, piercing into the solid oak. I felt my bladder nearly give as my wide eyes watched the shovel pull itself from the wood, then swiftly stab into the door again in a slightly different spot. Splinters flew while I continued to scream. I spun around to face the shovel as it impacted again on the opposite side of my head as before, sticking itself again in the door. Finally, the door behind me opened and I heard my wife start to speak, but she was cut off as the shovel flew through the open door and into our living room. She shrieked and I fell backward inside. I found the strength to stand and slammed the door behind me as I entered the house, pushing my wife out of the way. "Dan, what was that?" she screamed behind me. "Who's outside?" I didn't answer. I couldn't answer. I just looked out the front window, particularly at the Christmas lights on the fence. They were all on. "Dan!" "Shh, shh." I waved my hand at her, still looking out the window. After at least 5 minutes of peace passed, I found the courage to open the front door again. The front door was scarred beyond repair, but what had my attention was the front yard. Out there, carved into the snow and dirt with the shovel, was 4 letters, written in jagged, unsophisticated print. "I really don't know what to say, Dan," Ren said on the other end of my wife's phone. She had rejected every call I had tried to make, understandably so, since she probably assumed I was calling to tell her something to do for the work I originally had scheduled for her the next day. My wife was able to get her to answer, however, so I could make my actual intentions clear. "It's okay," I replied. "I don't expect you to say anything. I was in the wrong. I apologize. I should have been more understanding of your situation and less selfish." "What about the bid?" she asked. "Don't worry about that right now," I said. "Listen, Ren, I've had a very long, hard night of thinking, and something's been made very clear to me tonight. I guess what I'm trying to say is that some things might be more important than I might have realized, Christmas Day being one of those things. So like I said, just take the whole day and take the day after too if you like." "Well, I guess all I'll say then is thanks, Dan. And Merry Christmas." "Yeah, Merry Christmas." After hanging up the phone, My wife tried to ask what had happened and why I insisted on calling Ren right away, but after several minutes of no response, she stormed off back upstairs. To be honest, I can't remember exactly what she had been asking or how angry she might have gotten. I can only remember staring at the lights on our Christmas tree as she was talking, waiting for the bulbs to flicker.